We'll be starting in about 10 minutes, but if you're out there, welcome. And if you're out there, say hi on the chat line. And I hope you can hear the music. It's Haydn. It's actually the string quartet, The Lark, which is one of my favorite pieces. Of Haydn, that is, not of music in general. So, that's lovely. I actually used this in a production, not of a Sheridan play, but of my adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. This was the opening music for it. Something delightfully fun-filled, romantic about it. Just lifts the soul a little. Makes you want to smile, but it's delightfully lyrical. Hello, Joan. Hello, James. I see the chat's beginning to open up. Hello, Francis. And Jill. I'll repeat myself in a minute about the music when we get a few more people joining in with us, but I think our numbers are increasing dramatically as we come closer to 2 o'clock. It's rather nice to know that not only do we have outreach in Pittsburgh and indeed in Western Pennsylvania, but last week people were listening in from England, from Italy, and even from Wales. Nobody from Scotland, as far as I know, but to get England and Wales and Italy is not bad, as well as Western Pennsylvania and Allegheny County in particular. Hello, Kathleen. I have words about you later. It's sort of happy music, isn't it? Yeah. Haydn's quartets tended to be not somber. There was a kind of lyrical delight to them, and this one in particular. He may not have been Beethoven when it came to quartets, but he did have a sense of joy. I love it. But that's really true of the period, in a way. You might say that by the time we get to this period, it would be a brave and whole new world that had grown out of that what we discussed last week, the Restoration period. Ah, yes. Haydn did actually write a piece, the last 7 words of Christ, which might have been appropriate for today, being Good Friday. But then again, I thought, no, that might be a bit too somber. We'll stick with the string quartets. By the way, happy Easter to everybody. Easter weekend, isn't it great? We could all get out and go somewhere, except we can't get out and go anywhere. Easter was always that first holiday of the year, you know, the first sort of real vacation weekend of the year, and first time you could sort of go out and smell the spring. Ah, well, maybe next year. You never know. Thank you, Edward, and a happy holiday to you. I'm getting all these comments coming up on the side of my screen. It's lovely. It's nice to hear from you. And you have a blank screen. Have you tried turning it off and on again? Why is that? Yes, Rosemary, I do think the music is lovely. It's Haydn's one of those go-to, let's just put something on in the background and relax to it kind of composers. And we set you a little message there, so if you can try that. Hello, Dennis. Yeah, isn't it? It's gorgeous music. I'm trying to give you all something appropriate to the period of the writer each week. And as last week we had Purcell. This week we've got Haydn, and I haven't decided what I'm going to do next week yet. But next week will be fun because it's Oscar Wilde. And Oscar Wilde is always fun. Leaning forward because I'm basically blind and I have to read your little notes. Dennis, yes. Very appropriate for Oscar Wilde. As he said, a gentleman never looks at the view. Ah, there we are. Somebody in Cork, in Ireland. Hello there, Nicola. You see, we do have a broad reach. I see Anne can now see me. Thank you, Tim. Good afternoon to you, Keith, and I hope you're keeping well. Right, we're nearly coming up to time now. And Sarah, it may be balmy in Scott Township, but it's pretty balmy here in Regent Square as well, I can tell you. What happened to the lovely warm weather that we were having? Paul, you're very welcome. Okay, I think we're having passed the 2 o'clock mark. We should technically make a start on this. So we'll just take the music down to a dull zero and off we go. First of all, welcome everybody. Welcome to my home. It's lovely that that you're back with us again. And if you were here with me last week and rejoined this week, then I'm even more appreciative because you sort of know what to expect. So let me just first of all remind you, this is not an academic class. This is not a history lesson. It's not many things. All it is me chatting about 5 particular writers that I admire and who I believe had a very powerful influence on the development of English theatre. So as I said, I'll come to that again in a minute. Just let me begin by saying this is PICT Educates. This is PICT Classic Theatre coming to you in a way, the easiest way we can during this terrible time while we're all locked away in our own homes. Theatre all over the world is suffering because we cannot do the one thing that we need to do to create theatre, which is to congregate together in a single place and have that interaction between actors and audience. We cannot do this. And nobody really knows when we'll be able to do it again. We don't know how long those restrictions are going to happen, but it's certainly not going to switch off just on one particular day. The restrictions on groups gathering may go on for quite some time. We're hoping that we'll be back on stage in September. Most theatre companies are hoping that they'll be back on stage by September. But in the meantime, we suffer. Because it's not just financial, it's almost emotional and intellectual and spiritual. We suffer because our job is to communicate in a room with an audience. And when we can't be in a room with an audience, we can't function as theatre artists. Now, we're all trying to do this online, and there are many, many opportunities for you to experience theatre people and theatre activity online. And certainly here in Pittsburgh, just about every theatre is putting something out. And I want to assure you that we want you to support every single one of them, because we're all trying to do the same thing. We're all trying to reach out to our audience and say, we're still here. We're going to be here for you as long as we possibly can. So it's not just tuning into PICT Educates that we want you to do. We want you to tune into everything that's on offer, because we are one big family in a small community in Pittsburgh, and we want you to support all of us. That said, also, we can't sell tickets at the moment because we've no shows to sell tickets to, but it still costs money to keep the show on the road, or at least to keep the show in the office in a box. So all donations, we are really, really grateful for. You were very generous last week. I hope that this week you can match that. Every donation really counts, and it's extraordinary. Even when we're not in production, even when we're on lockdown like this, we still have to pay bills. We still have to keep the company operating. So every donation, you've heard me say this 1,000 times, no matter how small, every donation counts. So that's that said. Now, first I want to say, I mentioned earlier, just before we started, I want to congratulate Kathleen Donnelly. You were the winner last week of our trivia prize. The answer to the, I forgot what the question was now. The answer to the, what was it? Anyway, you won it. And I have a new question for you at the end of this program, and I'll probably have forgotten what that is by next week. But well done, Kathleen, and you get 2 tickets to our next production. The trivia question will come at the end, and what we're going to do this week is we're going to wait for all the answers that come in before midnight tonight, Pittsburgh time, and we'll put them into a file, and we'll let the computer decide who wins. And so we'll announce that tomorrow. But as I said, the question will come at the end, and the question will be directly related to something that I will say in the course of this particular conversation. So we're going to talk about Richard Brinsley Sheridan. But before I get to Sheridan, I want to say a few words about what we were talking about last week, because you might say that the birth of modern theatre for the English-speaking world began with the Restoration. That the kind of theatre that had existed before that and the kind of venues that had existed before that were a very different formula and format. And we still have the evidence of them. Of course, if you've been to London and visited the Globe Theatre, which is a recreation of Shakespeare's theatre, thanks mostly to the incredible work of an American, Sam Wanamaker, who fought most of his life to have that built, and it is an incredible facility. But there were other theatres apart from that. There was the Rose, which they've just recently, or about 10 or 12 years ago, I think, discovered the Rose while they were pulling down another building. These theatres were pre the Commonwealth, pre the Puritan shutdown. When Charles II returned, when the monarchy was restored and entertainment was restored, because all forms of entertainment had been banished by the Commonwealth government under Cromwell as Lord Protector. A new form of theatre, a new physical kind of building arose, and a new energy of writing, of theatre writing arose. And for the first time, women were allowed to act on stage. That was known as the Restoration period. And the Restoration period, in terms of history, and certainly in terms of theatre, 1660 to 1710. So you're talking about a period of about 50 years of creative writing for a new kind of stage. A stage and a kind of acting that was still very presentative, very much actors walking to the front of the stage, saying their lines and walking off and trying to be funny or trying to be tragic and all of that. But instead of just having what we've seen in the Globe, which was a basic, simple setup of doors and a balcony above and pillars at the side, suddenly you had scenery. And that scenery became more and more complex as theatres became more complex in their structure. So not only did you have scenery sliding on and sliding off, but you had it flying up and down as well. Little side bar here. The people often ask what the term break a leg means, and has it anything to do with physical violence? No. There are various stories. The one I actually believe is that all those pieces of scenery that were hanging they would be pulling up by ropes, and to make them as light as possible, instead of heavy timbers, they would use bamboo. And bamboo is incredibly strong. And all of the things that went up and down were known as legs. We still use that term for the curtains at the side of the stage now. But they were all legs, including the front, where you would have what is called the house cloth now, but that curtain at the front. And the story goes that if you pulled it up and down too quickly, then the bamboo would snap. In other words, too many curtain calls and you would break a leg. And so that was what was wished on you, that you might break a leg because you were so successful. Anyway, that all, little sidebar, that all came from this new physical form of theatre, the proscenium stage. And so the writers for this period, and Farquhar was one of them, had a tremendous freedom about them. Suddenly they were liberated. They could write and say whatever they wanted. The whole oppression of the Cromwellian period had gone. Now I'm going to quote, there's a historian, George Clark, and I'm going to quote from him because I think it's a brilliant assessment of the nature of Restoration drama. His quote is, "The best known fact about the Restoration drama is that it is immoral. The dramatists did not criticize the accepted morality about gambling, drink, love, and pleasure generally, or try, like the dramatists of our own time, to work out their own view of character and conduct. What they did was, according to their respective inclinations, to mock at all restraints. If you like a comparison, it is the difference between comedy and alternative comedy. Some were gross, others delicately improper. The dramatists did not merely say anything they liked, they also intended to glory in it and to shock those who did not like it." So that entire genre of Restoration comedy was about shocking the audience, was about saying the things that you couldn't say before, that religious restrictions had not only shut down freedom of speech, but the mechanism by which that speech could be addressed to an audience. And one of the few ways that, storytelling and theatre, because the alternative was going and listening to a sermon. The Country Wife, which was written by William Wycherley, 1675, so you could say right in the middle of the Restoration period, was actually considered, up to modern times, probably the most obscene play in the English canon. So it tells you a little bit something about Restoration theatre. It was considered obscene because it was honest about things like relationships and sex and all of that. Now, following on from that Restoration period, we move into a range of theatre and there are different ways to describe it, and different commentators will use different terminology. Some will say that Restoration lasted longer. Some will say it's all linked to what it is all linked, because I said last week, there is a line. There is this linear progression of theatre and of theatre writing, and indeed styles of acting that passed right the way through it. Styles of acting at that period were incredibly simple. It was literally addressing the audience. And you may have seen in movies about theatre in that time, where the actors would walk to the front of stage, say their lines, have their conversation, and walk off again. Very easy for directors, that. But we move really in what is generally accepted to be the period of the development of the comedy of manners. And comedy of manners is, it is what you choose it to be, but to my mind, it is because comedy, and I'm using comedy in the very pure sense, not the idea that everything is funny, but that there are plays where the plot is resolved, there is a satisfactory ending, all the ends are tied up neatly, and nobody dies. Unlike tragedy, where somebody dies, and very often in a tragedy, lots of people die. So over the post-Shakespearean period, you also had the Jacobean period of Jacobean tragedy and the revenge tragedies, where people were being slaughtered all over the place. But we're going to deal with comedy of manners, and that is very much following in the tradition of the Restoration comedy. Comedy manners, you'll find its roots in Roman plays, Horace. You find it in the Elizabethan playwrights, such as Shakespeare. The genre really only came into its own, though, after the corrupt plays of the Restoration. And I say the corrupt plays in the sense that they were dirtier, they were filthier. They were more blatantly about sex and sexual relations. But in the mid-1700s and to the late 1800s, we saw this richness of writing of comedy. And that also coincided with two particular Irish writers, the evolution of two writers who were Irish, who went to London and contributed phenomenally to the development of English-speaking theatre. And they were Richard Brinsley Sheridan at the beginning of that period and Oscar Wilde at the end of that period. In that time, we see this remarkable growth in the complexity of the satire within the plays. And it's interesting that these two playwrights are at each end of that time frame, and that they are both Irish, because they were, to my mind, the definitive creators of theatrical satire on the English stage. So today we're concentrating, next week we're going to concentrate on the other end, which is Oscar Wilde. But today we're going to look at Richard Brinsley Sheridan and what he offered. Sheridan is, I like to think of Sheridan as sort of, in a funny way, the father of West End theatre in the English sense of West End, or the London sense. It's not really true, but he always has that feel for me that he was as much a playwright, he was also an impresario. And he had a remarkable skill as a writer and a writer of comedy and the complexities of comedy. But he also was a theatre manager, and he had the wisdom of a producer, which very often directors and actors don't have. We don't have wisdom, we just have sometimes talent. But the producer is a different matter. The producer has a particular wisdom of what will work and what won't work and what the audience want to see. And usually they're right. And if they're really right, they become very rich, unlike actors and writers. But Richard Brinsley Sheridan had two of those particular gifts. He was a writer of enormous skill and imagination, and he was a producer. Not only that, he was also a politician. And I think being a good producer made him probably a good politician. He was born in 1751. Now, on our time scale, that was 40 years after the death of Farquhar, who was born 70 years after the death of Shakespeare. So you're beginning to see that I want you to see that there is a point of contact, because as I said last week, Farquhar was born that period after the death of Shakespeare, and in our time frame, that would be the same period between the Beatles' first #1 hit and today. So not a long time. 40 years, even shorter. It's frightening to think that 40 years, for instance, what really depresses me, 40 years ago, I was 30. So it's a bit scary. It was really quite recent in theatrical history that Sheridan arrived on the scene, as I say, only 40 years after the death of Farquhar. He was born in Dublin. Now, his mother was a writer, and she was a playwright and a novelist, which at that time was not particularly usual, but it was beginning to happen in the 1750s. By the time we get to the greatest of the early novelists in 1800, around 1800, or latter part of that period, you have Jane Austen emerging. So his father was a theatre manager and a leading actor. And he was, in fact, the manager at one point and leading actor at the Smock Alley Theatre, the theatre that Farquhar's career began in. So again, there is that point of association and that point of closeness and that point of inheritance. Theatrical tradition doesn't just happen, it is inherited. We learn, I mean, in the great Albert Einstein, I stand on the shoulders of giants. That's what we all do. No matter how much we think we're creating something new and modern and different, all we're doing is reimagining what went before us. The Sheridans basically inherited the theatre that Farquhar had worked in and learned his skill in. But the Sheridans moved to London. I think it was that classic thing that I mentioned last week. When you are successful and you want to get more successful, you tend to move to the capital. And the capital at that point, even for an Irishman, was London. So the Sheridans moved to London, and Richard went to what is now one of the great English public schools. The two great ones are Eton and Harrow, and Richard Sheridan went to Harrow. Interestingly, that was where Winston Spencer Churchill went to school as well. He had an interesting life. As a young man, he fell in love, as so often happens. Fell in love with a young woman called Elizabeth Ann Linley, and there was a bit of a cad, a military man, Captain Thomas Matthews, and in 1772 he published a piece in a newspaper that, shall we say, was mildly insulting to the said Elizabeth Ann Linley. So Sheridan fought not one duel with Matthews, but two. Sheridan wanted to marry her. She was his fiancée. And being a gentleman, what do you do when your fiancée is insulted in the newspapers? You slap the other guy on the cheek with a glove and you fight a duel. At least you did in 1772. So the first duel was a complete mess. This is quite wonderfully theatrical. And he did use the point in one of his plays. They had to keep changing the location of the duel on the first time because the crowds kept gathering. I think there were 4 different locations, one of which, as far as I remember, was where Apsley House now stands. And Apsley House, somewhat after that, was built by a certain Duke of Wellington as his city home in London. And because it was the first house you would find in London off the Great West Road, he called it Number 1 London. Anyway, the duel kept moving around. It was a terrible mess. It ended very unromantically. The captain lost his sword and ended up begging for mercy. So, which was granted. Unfortunately, that was reported in the newspapers. I'll come to the newspapers in a moment. Matthews wouldn't accept the defeat and challenged Sheridan to another duel. So they had another duel, 1772, July. Both men broke their swords, but carried on fighting because it was all about life and honor. Both were wounded. Matthews slightly, Sheridan dangerously. It's a quote says, "Borne from the field with a portion of his antagonist's weapon sticking through an ear, his whole body covered in wounds and blood, and his face nearly beaten to jelly with the hilt of Matthews' sword." So it must have been a bit of a scrap. Anyway, he pulled through, and this second duel had taken place in the town of Bath in the west of England, and the Bath Chronicle announced that he was now out of danger. Captain Matthews actually, instead of, because they should have been prosecuted, but he escaped and was, I think, not seen again for some considerable period of time. So, as a result of all this, Sheridan married this wonderful wife over whom he fought and risked his life. And in the great tradition of actors, because he had become an actor, he wasn't quite writing yet, he set up house in London with, and again, as I say, the great tradition of actors, with a lavish lifestyle that he couldn't possibly afford. And they started to get very broke very quickly. But that's young love for you. He eventually began writing, and his first play, which 1775 he produced, was called The Rivals, and was presented at Covent Garden Theatre. I said to you last week there were 2 main theatres: Covent Garden Theatre, Drury Lane Theatre. The Rivals is a wonderful play, and I'll talk about that again in a moment. But it was a flop. He'd presented it himself, a bit like self-publishing nowadays. He put the play on at Covent Garden. It was a flop. But it wasn't because it was a bad play. It was just because the leading role he had cast very badly. So he recast the leading role, put the show on again, and it was an immediate hit, which, of course, I believe proves the fact that writers can make great scripts, but it's actors that make great and successful theatre. And every writer friend of mine will start objecting to that comment as usual. But it was the fact that he put the right actor in the right part, and suddenly you have this play that is still being produced regularly because it is so glorious. During this time, because he was making a lot of money off the rivals, the actor David Garrick, who was getting a bit old at this point, wanted to sell his shares in the Drury Lane Theatre. That's the other one I mentioned. And so Sheridan bought out Garrick's shares in Drury Lane and became the de facto owner, and that's where he put on all his future plays. The most famous of which, School for Scandal, which he put on in 1777. Notice 1775 and 1777. In the intervening year, something rather significant happened in terms of British and American politics. I'll come to that again later. School for Scandal, it's considered one of the greatest comedies of manners in English. I would put it in the top 5. But I would also put 4 of Oscar Wilde's plays in that top 5 as well. So I'm a little prejudiced, but I do think that School for Scandal is one of the most remarkably clever comedies ever written. Just to continue on the topic of Sheridan, he became a member of Parliament in 1780. And he was in Parliament for a very long time, and he actually had a couple of ministerial posts. But his particular claim to fame was that he was very much in support of the American colonies and the independence debate. It is said that, by the way, that just to show you that nothing changes, that he bribed his way into Parliament, and his maiden speech in Parliament was on the subject of bribery and corruption. But he was a member of the British Parliament for 32 years, which is not bad going. There is, and some of you may have seen the little teaser we did, the story of the fire. The story goes, one version is that he was in the Parliament building, one is that he was on the street, but that the Drury Lane Theatre caught fire. And I prefer the one that he was watching from the Parliament building, because in the distance you could see the flames and the smoke and everything going up. And he was sitting there with a glass of wine in his hand, and somebody came up to him and said, Mr. Sheridan, what are you doing here? Your theater's on fire. And he responded, but may a man not sit by his own fireside with a glass of port without being disturbed. I love that. It's a dry sense of humor that pervades through all of this kind of theatre and of his fellow countrymen. Just to wrap him up in terms of history, he lost his seat in Parliament eventually, ended up in poverty. The US, this is not generally known, the United States Congress voted him £20,000 because of the service he gave in the American independence movement, but he refused it. And therefore, like all true Irish artists, he died in complete poverty, 1815. And you can find his tomb in Westminster Abbey in Poets' Corner, along with so many of his compatriots. So his plays, as I said, the first and one of the most successful, and still, is The Rivals. Going back, as it were, to sorry, it's a little sip of coffee. Going back to the Restoration motif. The plays in this period were still very much about the principle of, men seeking women and women seeking men for sexual purposes. This whole concept still survives in this, and in fact doesn't change. Comedy, in fact, it's the story of life, really, isn't it? But it doesn't change much, but it becomes more subtle and more complex. There is more emphasis, in fact, on love rather than sexual conquest. But we're still in that same motif. The line that I talk about is still there, and you're going to see it again when we come to Wilde, and to a degree when you come to Shaw. The characters, and now there is a principle of character naming that comes down from the Restoration period and maintains its way through here. So the characters, very often, their name will tell you what their nature is. I mean, there is a play where the villain is called Maskwell, because nobody knows he's the villain, because he masks well. Pretty obvious. In The Rivals, the names of the characters are very much a guide to their names. So you have, for instance, Sir Anthony Absolute and his son Jack Absolute. So the word absolute has two potential meanings, and both of them are true. Sir Anthony Absolute absolutely is dogmatic in his rejection and disgust at everything that his son does. And his son, Jack Absolute, is absolutely honest, absolutely fair, and absolutely a hero. So we're using the words in a very, very precise way. The heroine in this is she's a young lady who presents herself with what might describe as a fading nature. So her name is Lydia Languish. He also created a character in this play whose name has actually gone into the English language rather brilliantly. I talked about complexity, and Sheridan was almost delighted in the complexity of his plot laying and the dialogue that he provided. There is a Restoration play called The Way of the World, which the plot is so complex, I've known actors who were in it to lose track of the story. But this complexity is part of the game. And the more complex you can make the plot, and again, I'll come to that in a moment, the more complex you can make the plot, the more the audience is left guessing. It's it's a game of Clue. You know, it's what the hell is happening? Who are these people, and why are they saying these things? And you're constantly being presented with new plot, new ideas, and new character twists. Anyway, to come back, he created in The Rivals this wonderful woman who she represents, I think, the level of education, or the lack of education, that the English upper middle classes had at that time, and very possibly still through to today, if you look at the way political thinking goes in the United Kingdom. And also an incredible level of snobbery. Her name is Mrs. Malaprop. And the word that has gone into the English language, thanks to that, is the term malapropism, which is the ability to say the wrong word, but completely believe that you are in the right. I shall give you an example, a couple of examples. She's speaking to Sir Anthony concerning her ward. I shall prepare Lydia to receive your son's invocations, and I hope you will represent her to the captain as an object not altogether illegible. Now, it's a simple example of it. She refers to allegories on the Nile, meaning alligators, of course. Here's another example of it concerning education. Now, remember, the growth in this period was not simply of comedy and not simply of plotline, but also of satire. In these plays, we will find the root of both farce and satire. And these two lines, they did eventually drift apart. But both of these, in these plays, both of these theatrical forms, you can see the not just the embryo, but you can actually see them beginning to grow. Mrs. Malaprop again. Sir Anthony, I would by no means wish a daughter of mine to be a progeny of learning. I don't think so much learning becomes a young woman. For instance, I would never let her meddle with Greek, or Hebrew, or algebra, or simony, or fluxions, or paradoxes, or such inflammatory branches of learning. Neither it would be necessary for her to handle any of your mathematical, astronomical, diabolical instruments. But, Sir Anthony, I would send her at 9 years old to a boarding school in order to learn a little ingenuity and artifice. Then, sir, she should have a supercilious knowledge in accounts. And as she grew up, I would have her instructed in geometry. that she might know something of the contagious countries. But above all, sir, she should be a mistress of orthodoxy, that she might not misspell and mispronounce words so shamefully as girls usually do, and likewise that she might reprehend the true meaning of what she is saving. This, Sir Anthony, is what I would have a woman know, and I don't think there is a superstitious article in it. Now, it's cumbersome, perhaps today, but in its day, and it still works on stage, it is a complete and wonderful satirical demonstration of the absurdity of the upper middle classes. Nothing has changed. In essence, these plays of Sheridan's and others in the genre, the fundamental that is almost prerequisite in the writing of these plays is the complexity of the plot twists. That you set something up, you set up a proposition, and then you twist it and turn it and twist it and turn it in so many different directions that you begin to wonder what is going on, why, and yet each time that something absurd does happen, it is hysterically funny. So you will see, as I say, the rudiments, not only the rudiments, you will see the actual constructs of both farce and satire happening parallel in these plays all the time. They do depend on certain things. You will always find buffoon characters. There's always the country bumpkin. The guy, he's not stupid. There's an old Irishism. I might be thick, but I'm not stupid. Ignorance does not mean stupidity. Ignorance means lack of education or lack of sophistication. But usually the buffoon characters, while appearing to be buffoons, are in fact smarter than the clever characters. You also, in these plays, you will get Irish characters. In The Rivals, for instance, you get Sir Lucius O'Trigger. The letter O and the apostrophe in front of Trigger tells us that he's Irish, because there's nothing Irish about Lucius Trigger. In fact, when the play was first done, he was criticized for mocking the Irish. Sheridan was criticized for mocking the Irish. Now, there's one thing that the Irish do wonderfully, it's mock themselves. Many years later, George Bernard Shaw once said, if you put an Irishman on a spit, you'll always find another Irishman to turn it. But the characters, if you want to have a character who is somewhat absurd, especially in the area of bravado and duplicity, you will make him an Irishman. Where Farquhar created such a character as Captain Brazen, Sheridan makes him Irish. And in the course of this play, there is a duel that fails miserably. It is the most incompetent and badly fought duel ever. Sheridan drawing upon the experience of his own life. The Irish character will, when it's there, just like the Jewish character, and that occurs in his other great play, School for Scandal, will always be considered a character of comedy. They will advance the plot. They're not peripheral. They are actually part of the plot, but they will always be presented as a character of comedy. And so you've got Sir Lucius O'Trigger in The Rivals. You have Moses in School for Scandal. And they are used very specifically because at that period they used character types. It was the Irishman, the Jew. There was no political correctness involved. But all the groundwork for what will develop into farce on one hand and satiric comedy on the other, all of it lies in these plays. There lies the Irish root, that of the satiric, because the Irish writer has a greater, I believe, aptitude for being satiric. I talked a little about The Rivals. In School for Scandal, we really have the satiric writer at his very best. He deals not with the lower end of society, but with that part that generally deserves most satiric abuse, which is the middle class, the bourgeoisie. Because the classic example being the middle class, don't have the earthiness of the peasant and don't have the authority of the aristocrat. All they have is money. It is the new rich, the nouvelle riche, the bourgeoisie. In School for Scandal, we have, I believe, one of his most savage stabs at that level of society. And the word scandal is the important point. The play begins with Lady Sneerwell. Note the name, Sneerwell. We know exactly who she is the moment her name is mentioned. There is no subtlety in that. She's asking her lackey, who is called Snake, so we know exactly what he is, whether he spread a new scandal concerning her friends. I'm going to read some notes which I found online because they demonstrate the complexity of the plot and the characters far better than I could ever do it. So just bear with me, I'm going to read you this. Lady Sneerwell, a wealthy young widow, and her hireling, Snake, discuss her various scandal-spreading plots. Snake asks why she's so involved in the affairs of Sir Peter Teazle, his ward Maria, and Charles and Joseph Surface. Notice the word surface. Again, two meanings. Joseph Surface, who is just totally on the surface, has no depth, no meaning to him at all. Charles Surface, the hero, he is totally upfront. He wears his heart on his sleeve. He is completely honest, decent guy, and drinks a lot. But that's okay. The two young men under Sir Peter's informal guardianship, and why she has not yielded to the attentions of Joseph, who is highly respectable. Lady Sneerwell confides that Joseph wants Maria, who is an heiress, and that Maria wants Charles. Thus, she and Joseph are plotting to alienate Maria from Charles by putting out rumors of an affair between Charles and Sir Peter's new young wife, Lady Teazle. Joseph arrives to confer with Lady Sneerwell. Maria enters herself there, fleeing the attentions of Sir Benjamin Backbite and his uncle Crabtree. Mrs. Candor enters, who ironically talks about how tale-bearers are as bad as tale-makers. Soon after that, Sir Benjamin and Crabtree also enter, bringing a good deal of gossip with them. One item is the imminent return of the Surface brothers' rich uncle Sir Oliver from the East Indies, where he has been for 16 years. Another is Charles's dire financial situation. You can see this all takes place within one short scene. Plot upon plot upon plot upon plot. Building of relationships, making it more complex. The audience don't know where to look. But the skill of the writing is always to direct the audience's attention onto the particular moment. And that moment can swing from pathos to extreme farce in a moment. The audience is constantly kept on the edge of the seat thinking, what in the name of all that is holy can possibly happen next? And it does, and it always surprises. That is the point about these plays. The incredible complexity of the plot, not just farcical, but also deeply, deeply satirical. We are dealing with a fashion that had occurred over this period. And because something rather significant had happened. Over this period, a new thing emerged, newspapers. Newspapers, suddenly you could get the news. And people would sit in another new invention called coffee houses. It was the equivalent in that period of sitting in Starbucks with your cell phone, finding out what was happening in the world. Well, they used to sit in coffee houses and they used to read newspapers. In fact, it was a coffee house in London that created the insurance industry, because a group of businessmen used to meet in Lloyd's coffee house and decide that one way to make money was to get other people to give it to them, and they would guarantee to pay the expenses of anything that went wrong. And Lloyd's of London was born. Coffee houses were the nerve center of imaginative activity. But newspapers had really come on the scene in a big way. People were reading, and not just news, but something infinitely more important to them, gossip. The gossip column. So in this period, yes, the Times was born and the Chronicle and all the other serious newspapers, but also at the same time, the embryonic versions of what would eventually become the National Enquirer, or People magazine, or whatever those dreadful things are. So sorry, I just lost my note there. Ah, yes. So what Sheridan sets out to do is to demonstrate that the gossip column, that the way that middle-class society was, as it were, entertaining and destroying itself, was in fact a fundamental antisocial evil. And it became worse and worse and worse. So he set about in this play to demonstrate just how much scandal, how much harm it can cause, how people's reputations can be destroyed just by rumor. And Lady Sneerwell is that classic example of somebody who sets about destroying reputation. Shakespeare actually did write probably one of the best lines or speeches on the topic in the play Othello, where Iago the villain speaks about reputation or one's good name. The speech is, "Good name in man and woman, dear my lord, is the immediate jewel of their souls. Who steals my purse steals trash. 'Tis something, nothing. 'Twas mine, 'tis his, and has been slave to thousands. But he that filches from me my good name robs me of that which not enriches him and makes me poor indeed." It's a beautiful thing by Shakespeare, taken up, I think, by Sheridan in a remarkably clever way. He absorbs that point and recognizes where that damage comes from, that it's a human failing, this desire to destroy other people through lies, that we lie about each other. And when we lie about each other, we cause a degree of damage that is almost impossible to remove. I will give you an example in our time. We all know about the Harvey Weinstein trial and the evidence produced against him. There was another very famous person who was prosecuted for crimes against young people, who has just had that sentence reversed. That was Cardinal George Pell. And it's happened throughout history that people have been accused of something and then their appeal has been upheld and they have been declared innocent and they're meant to leave the court without a stain on their character. But gossip leaves a stain. There is no escaping from it. And once the rumor is out there, it is terribly difficult. It's a human failing, but there's nothing you can do about it. It's just the way we are. It's the human condition. That once scandal is out there, it is very difficult to remove that suspicion. You will always doubt. Once somebody has been painted scarlet, it's very difficult to paint them white again, because in your imagination, the scarlet is always showing through. But this is the point of Sheridan in his play. It's an evil. The reputation or the bad reputation, the scandal can ruin so many innocent lives. And amongst the newly rich and the bored in that society, that period of English history, indulgence in scandal became rife. And I say they were bored because they were new rich. New money was pouring in. We were also having at that period the development of the new empire, the East India Company. The Surface's brother, Joseph Surface, is returning from the East Indies, where he has huge investments and has made vast sums of money. He's become a very rich man. So you had all this new money pouring in from investments. These investments, sometimes good, sometimes bad, but they were making a new rich who were bored. And so gossip became a game. Wealthy people always invent games in order to fill their idle hours. Like all good theatre, Sheridan's plays took up these points. And like a good Irishman, made them very satiric. He did not want to as another Irish writer proved his skill at doing it, he didn't want to alienate his audience because his audience were the very people he was satirizing. He wanted to entertain them, but hopefully prick their consciences in the process of doing so. I think the great moral about that we learn from Sheridan, because you should never spread scandal for fear that scandal may be spread about you. Anyway, that's all I'm going to tell you about that. I'm going to look at some questions that are coming in, because we've only got about 10 minutes left. We've got some questions coming in. I think, let me have a look at this. Bear with me a moment. And what have we got here now? Deborah. Did I ever see the film series, The Brewery Boys, where the character spoke only in malaprops? Great fun. No, I didn't see that, but using malaprops has become a very, very clever theatrical device. Sheridan really did start something, and very often you'll see that. There was a famous Dublin character known as Zosimus, who would write little pieces. One about the finding of Moses in a basket contagious to the Nile. Malaprops have become such a fun thing. Any personal stories about when I directed School for Scandal? Well, I did direct School for Scandal in Pittsburgh, actually. I directed it in Point Park. And it was an utter joy because it was a cast of students. And none of them, I think, had ever done what we call heightened text before, or they had very little experience of it. One of the problems with Sheridan is that the text is actually more complex, far more complex than Shakespeare, and the rhythms are more complex. Shakespeare makes it easy using pentameter, but Sheridan uses a density of English that came out because English was developing. I think one of the things his father did was to write a book, sort of an educational guide to the formal presentation of the English language. It was only beginning to create a formal style, and spelling, even things like spelling, was only beginning to formulate itself. It had been in flux from the time of Chaucer. So Sheridan's use of language was very complex, and the students really had to learn to speak a new language before they could actually do. And any actor who's never done Sheridan or Restoration comedy sort of has to learn a new language when they're doing it. It's English as she is not spoken anymore, whereas Shakespeare, which was 100 years earlier, is English as she's very much still spoken. Are the Sheridan plays, especially School for Scandal, character-driven or plot-driven? That's a very good question, and my answer is yes. They are very much plot-driven. The whole purpose and structure of this is to engage you in an ongoing plot cycle. Now, remember what I said about the way these plays were staged. They were very much done on an open stage with a lot of scenery, some of it moving, but with the actors walking on, playing the scenes, walking off. Now, by the time you get to Sheridan, there was more furniture available, but still, it was very much set-piece staging. And so you had to have a complexity of plot, because the visual thing, what you were looking at, was very often not tremendously exciting. So the plot has to keep driving. But the plot only drives if the characters are clearly defined. Now, you have the advantage in that period where you're using character names so that the audience know what you are. You don't spend time establishing who's a villain, who's a hero, or who's a heroine, and who's a bitch. You have that by the use of names. So, as I say, there are two meanings to the word surface in School for Scandal, just as there are two meanings to the word absolute in The Rivals. But you have Lady Sneerwell, Lady Teazle, who is constantly flirting with everyone. Sir Peter Teazle has the most wonderful opening line for a character. When an old man takes a young wife, he has nothing to blame but himself. And so you had that wonderful situation again of the older man taking the younger wife, and what a mess that's going to turn into. all of these complexities. The names of the characters are there to define who that character is, so you can follow that without having to work it out, without having anything to get in the way of following the story. I suppose in a way the plot supersedes, but the characters drive it, and the characters are absolutely defined from the moment they walk onto the stage. So, I'm running out of time. Let's have a look at the side here. Wait a minute, here's another. Are you more pro-original text or pro-adapted text when it comes to doing Sheridan? It's a very good question. One of the difficulties is there's no finite script. A bit like Shakespeare, there are at least two versions of School for Scandal because he rewrote it. I'm personally, wherever possible, in favor of doing the script as we receive it. I don't like modernizing. If you're going to modernize, then completely modernize it. Write a new play on the same story. But I don't think there's any need to do that, because if it's well enough acted and if the actors are skillful enough in the delivery of the lines, you're going to understand what's being said. No, I wouldn't advocate modernizing. I'm looking for more. Sorry, I have to look at. Sorry, making a mess of my computer. Did Sheridan write some bad plays as a kid? I think he did. I don't know what became of them. I've never been interested in that, because one tends, as a working professional, I remember I'm not an academic, I'm a professional actor and director. So one tends to just interest oneself in the things that are pretty good. You know, I'm a great believer that undiscovered masterpieces have usually been undiscovered for a very good reason, that they're not masterpieces. It's very rare you discover a brilliant play that nobody's ever done before. It does happen, but not a lot. There's a question. Sean, you ask, when I talk about stock character types, the Irishman, the Jew, did that idea extend back to the time of Shakespeare, a la Shylock? No, not quite in the same way. There are certain stock characters in Shakespeare, but generally speaking, Shakespeare wrote people rather than characters. He didn't use stock characters in the same way. And Shylock is not a stock character. He's not a stock Jew. For instance, Shylock begins the play almost wanting to be one of the Christians, wanting to be one of the guys. He becomes more conscious of his Jewishness as the play progresses. So he's not by any means a stock character. I don't think. I mean, I'm sure there are, if I put my mind to it, but they're not similar. No. Right. Okay. How are we doing? Oh my God! It's nearly 3 o'clock. Okay. So that's that for this week. Thank you all for being here. Next week we are going to be discussing my personal hero, and that's Oscar Wilde. And as I say, if Sheridan was the beginning of this particular period, Wilde was the conclusion of this particular period. From sort of the mid-1700s, mid to late 1700s, to the end of the 1800s. So we will see where Wilde takes up this concept of the comedy of manners and brings a new and fresh approach of that into the English theatre. As I said at the beginning, we're thrilled to be able to do this. It's a way of reaching out to our wonderful, wonderful loyal audience. There's so little we can do for you in these terrible times, but this at least is something. And I have other things planned. We're going to be doing, as I said, I think last week, we're putting together some poetry with some of our actors. If we're still in this situation in June, I promise we will have a Bloomsday, even if it's a virtual Bloomsday. We'll have it online if we can't do it in reality somewhere. We're going to try to keep bringing you as much as we can. And thank you so much for tuning in to us. As I say again, we do need your help. Every donation really, really, really matters. And whatever you can send to us, you can go online, you can press the big red button, on the emails. Any donation, seriously important, and thank you for that. One last thing, the trivia question. I mentioned a couple of times, both last week and this week, a particular theatre in London, the Drury Lane Theatre, and the fact that it was owned by David Garrick, the actor, and it was also owned by Richard Brinsley Sheridan. Trivia question. Who owns the present Drury Lane Theatre? See you next week. Bye now.